It was the summer of 1945, a few months after the guns fell silent across Europe, that the first trains of German prisoners arrived at small, unremarkable camps scattered across the American Midwest. The sun lay heavy on the flat fields of Iowa and Kansas, painting the barracks in sharp shadows that contrasted with the long, pale grass beyond the fences. Victory had been proclaimed in newspapers, on street corners, and in official addresses. Banners and flags celebrated a world reborn from the ashes of war. Yet beyond the celebratory clamor, behind the taut wire and watchful guard towers, a quieter, more ambiguous history was unfolding. Here, in these secluded enclosures, women who had once been caught in the machinery of an aggressive war found themselves measured not as soldiers, not as enemies, but as human beings within a framework designed to contain, observe, and manage them. They arrived in clusters, faces pale from weeks of travel, eyes darting between the unfamiliar and the regimented. Their uniforms hung loosely, threadbare and stiff from months in camps that lacked adequate hygiene or comfort. The air smelled faintly of coal smoke, dry earth, and the iron tang of unwashed hands pressed against the rails. For some, it was the first time they had left the ruins of bombed cities or the frozen barracks of Eastern Europe. For others, the vast plains of America were a silent landscape, both indifferent and unyielding. In the official records, they were catalogued with numbers and routine notations: height, age, occupation, captured location. Yet none of those documents captured the tremor of nerves, the uncertainty of bodies suddenly exposed to a new order, one governed less by fear of shells and more by regulation and careful observation. Inside the barracks, the routines were deliberate and meticulous. Each morning, the women were woken by the clatter of boots on wooden floors and the sharp, clipped commands of guards who spoke in a language sometimes only partially understood. Beds were made with precision, uniforms inspected for cleanliness, and meals delivered on trays in a cadence that echoed through the empty spaces. Yet amid the rigidity, there existed moments of dissonance, tiny instances when ordinary human needs collided with the extraordinary circumstances of confinement. It was in one of these quietest acts, the offering of soap for bathing, that a profound tension emerged, a tension that would reverberate long after the war had ended. The introduction of soap was unremarkable to the Americans administering the camps. It was to them a practical matter. Hygiene reduced illness, made management easier, and projected a semblance of civilized care upon those under their charge. Yet for the German women, accustomed to scarcity, dirt as armor, and the long, unforgiving routines of wartime deprivation, the white, fragrant bars represented something far more complicated. To lather, to wash the skin that had become accustomed to grit and grime, was to confront a paradox of the body and the mind. Each stroke of the hand, each rinse of the water, carried the weight of disbelief. A strange intimacy of care administered by those they had once considered enemies, a quiet generosity that challenged the categories of friend and foe. Some wrote of it in diaries with trembling hands, describing the first sensation of warm water running down arms that had become calloused and cold. It felt like a betrayal and a mercy at once, one noted, the phrase terse, almost detached, yet suffused with an undercurrent of bewilderment. Others recalled the scent of soap mingling with the lingering odors of barracks, a contradiction that seemed almost to mock the simplicity of cleanliness. There were whispers among the women about the absurdity of it. How could an enemy care for them in a way so mundane, so ordinary, when outside the fences the world still burned with news of death, occupation, and judgment? And yet, the baths continued, repeated in quiet cadence, each a ritual that neither fully healed nor entirely exposed, but left the body and mind suspended between expectation and reality. The guards observed, at a distance, the subtle shifts in posture and expression. They saw the hesitation before entering the showers, the careful adjustment of uniform before leaving, the fleeting glances exchanged in a language that was more gesture than speech. In official logs, these movements were noted only in terms of compliance and efficiency, yet the human observer could not ignore the faint traces of wonder, unease, and reluctant acknowledgement of the care that had been offered. The paradox was unmistakable. These were prisoners marked by the world as culpable, yet they were being offered the simplest of comforts, comforts that carried implications the administrators scarcely considered. Outside the fences, the broader world celebrated a clear-cut victory, a narrative of triumph that left little room for ambiguity. Newspapers published lists of liberated territories, statistics of destroyed armaments, photographs of cheering crowds. In the camps, however, the women experienced no such clarity. They were isolated within barbed wire, their pasts condensed into numbers, their futures uncertain. The gift of soap, the warm water, the subtle attentions of guards and nurses, became a lens through which the contradictions of the war, the fragility of human morality, and the porous boundary between cruelty and care were made tangible. Here, history was not proclaimed from a podium. It was sensed, touched, smelled, and felt in moments of quiet vulnerability. Even the physical environment played a role in shaping their experience. The concrete floors, damp and cold beneath bare feet. The tin walls that amplified the splash of water and the faint murmur of voices. The thin light that fell through high windows, revealing dust motes dancing in the air, all contributed to a setting that was both confining and oddly revealing. In such spaces, the mundane became laden with meaning. The act of washing was no longer simply hygiene. It was a confrontation with identity, with the self as both survivor and culpable participant in a vast, destructive conflict. The paradox, the tension, the quiet reflection. All of it persisted as the women adapted to the rhythm of camp life. The baths remained, recurring as ritualized gestures of control and care, neither wholly punitive nor entirely redemptive. They were an intrusion into the psyche, a gentle but insistent reminder that even in captivity, the ordinary could unsettle, and the simple could challenge the most entrenched assumptions of guilt, innocence, and morality. And so the camps continued, summer giving way to fall, the landscape shifting from sun-baked plains to the soft gray of approaching winter. The women moved through the routines, the baths, the inspections, the sparse meals, carrying the paradox of their situation as invisibly as the dust that clung to their clothes. Each day passed in measured cadence, yet beneath the surface questions lingered, about the nature of care, the meaning of humanity, and the distance between survival and understanding. In these quiet, suspended moments, the world beyond the fences seemed at once distant and irrelevant, and the most ordinary of acts, the running of water over a body, the friction of a hand against skin, carried a weight that no record, no photograph, and no proclamation of victory could ever fully convey. It was in that tension, that careful balance between fear and recognition, between the enforced order of captivity and the surprising intimacies of care, that the story began. A story not of armies or battles but of bodies and minds, of small gestures and quiet awakenings, of a paradox that would linger long after the gates were opened and the women returned to a Europe scarred yet alive. How does one reconcile the gift of a bath with the shadow of a world they had helped to destroy? That question, lingering and unresolved, would follow them like a faint echo, across continents and decades, shaping memory more powerfully than any decree or headline ever could. Morning arrived in the camps with a mechanical precision. The sound of boots striking wooden floors, the sharp calls of guards, and the low murmur of prisoners stirring became a rhythm as predictable as the sun rising over the flat Midwest plains. The women moved with hesitant familiarity through the routines imposed upon them. Beds made with strict attention to folds, blankets tucked with exactitude, uniforms inspected for wrinkles or dust. It was a choreography that demanded compliance, yet beneath the surface, each step carried subtle negotiation with fear, memory, and the unfamiliar authority of captors who combined discipline with unexpected care. Breakfast was delivered on tin trays, the clang of utensils on metal echoing through the barracks. Soft bread, thin soup, occasionally a slice of fruit, were the fare that sustained them, and each meal became a ritual in observation. Diaries and later recollections note how the women would handle the trays, sometimes weighing the portions silently, sometimes sharing crumbs in whispered complicity. The taste of food, often bland yet consistent, contrasted sharply with the scarcity and variety of wartime rations. And in this contrast emerged a quiet disorientation, the senses registering abundance without the freedom to claim it fully. Hygiene was similarly regimented. Twice each week, the women were required to bathe under the watch of nurses and guards. Initially, many approached the showers with suspicion, fingers curling around the edges of soap, hesitant to submit their bodies to such unfamiliar attention. The water was warm, a surprise to limbs conditioned to cold or contaminated supplies, and the friction of lathered hands against skin was at once alien and necessary. Some wrote later that it was a strange mixture of shame and relief. Shame at exposing the body, relief in the simple sensation of cleansing. It was a quiet, dissonant transformation, a ritual neither punishment nor reward, but capable of altering the perception of self. Each day, I felt the water as if it carried questions, one prisoner later recalled in a handwritten diary fragment. Questions I could not answer. Questions I did not dare ask. Another wrote of the smell of soap mingling with the lingering odors of barracks and bodies, producing a scent that was almost obscene in its cleanliness. Yet in these moments, small alliances formed among the women. A shared glance, a whispered word, a hand extended to steady a trembling companion. Even in a controlled and surveilled environment, human connection persisted, quiet and fragile, a counterpoint to the structure imposed by guards and administrators. The guards themselves were not immune to observation and reflection. Reports filed in the camp archives are mostly bureaucratic, noting compliance, health status, and disciplinary incidents, yet private letters and post-war interviews reveal unease. Some recognized the paradox of enforcing confinement while witnessing gestures of care that seemed, at times, to humanize the prisoners. They saw hesitation before showers, glimpsed confusion and relief in the women's expressions, and occasionally admitted to themselves that the enforced routines were producing subtle psychological shifts that could not be measured in reports. One guard recalled in later testimony, "I could see them changing. Not in rebellion, not in gratitude exactly, but in some quiet way they were becoming different. And I wasn't sure if I should be glad or afraid of it." Beyond the showers and meals, daily life was punctuated by labor and instruction. The women were assigned tasks: cleaning, sewing, maintaining barracks, and tending small gardens. These tasks were simple, repetitive, yet infused with a latent tension. They demanded effort, obedience, and attention, and yet in their ordinariness, they became a lens through which the women began to measure their own agency and capacity for adaptation. Diaries note the tactile qualities of these activities: the rough texture of cloth under fingertips, the resistance of broom against concrete floors, the faint smell of earth and cut grass in outdoor labor. In these moments, physical reality and psychological processing intersected, and the women's internal lives became as structured as the external routines. Letters from home, when they arrived, brought both relief and new tension. Some letters were sparse, containing only brief reassurances of family survival. Others were elaborate, filled with news of destroyed homes, shifting borders, and lingering political instability. The women read them quietly, often in the corners of barracks, letting the words settle in their minds alongside the routine sounds of camp life. In their reflections, they noted a dissonance between the ordinariness of their daily tasks, making beds, washing floors, scrubbing dishes, and the magnitude of loss, guilt, and memory carried from the war. This juxtaposition, of small acts against a backdrop of monumental destruction, shaped their consciousness in ways that neither punishment nor generosity alone could account for. Over time, a subtle psychological shift emerged. The repeated cycles of care and routine began to register differently. Some women described an almost imperceptible softening, a reconsideration of self, though it was layered over memory, shame, and ideological conditioning from years of indoctrination. Others resisted internally, maintaining distance, recounting in diaries the tension between external compliance and inner disbelief. "I scrubbed my arms and I wondered if this was surrender or salvation," one wrote. Such observations highlight the liminality of their experience. Caught between historical forces and intimate, sensory realities, the prisoners were navigating a terrain without precedent. Social interactions among the women were similarly complex. Friendships formed and dissolved in whispers and glances. Mistrust and solidarity coexisted uneasily. Some confided in others about letters received, plans for post-war survival, or recollections of bombing raids and forced marches. Others remained silent, choosing the containment of thought over the vulnerability of speech. Even in these interactions, the presence of guards and the knowledge of surveillance imposed a subtle but constant weight. Every conversation, every shared laugh or sigh, carried layers of calculation and subconscious self-preservation. Moments of quiet realization were not always verbalized. Diaries and oral histories describe the sensation of standing in line for food or labor, feeling the warmth of the sun on shoulders, the texture of blankets against the skin, or the smell of freshly swept floors. These details, seemingly trivial, became markers of a transformation that was psychological rather than ideological. The women were learning, in a quiet, bodily way, that life could continue in structures unfamiliar, that care could coexist with constraint, and that the human capacity for adaptation was both resilience and vulnerability. Yet paradox remained. The act of bathing, once shocking and disorienting, became routine, yet routine did not erase its significance. Each shower was a reminder of the strangeness of kindness, the fragility of agency under observation, and the persistent tension between being treated as human and being marked by collective guilt. Guards and nurses recognized it partially as a subtle shift in posture or expression, but could not articulate its meaning in reports or protocols. They saw compliance, efficiency, and occasional smiles, yet the psychological interiority of the women remained largely inaccessible to those who oversaw them. Even small ceremonies such as inspections or health checks revealed contradictions. The women would stand at attention, uniforms pressed, hands at sides, faces carefully composed. Yet beneath that composure, diaries note tremors of fear, flashes of memory, or private acknowledgement of surprise at the care extended. "I do not know if I am a prisoner or a guest," one wrote, "but the water knows me better than either title." These passages underscore the way sensory experience, ritual, and observation interlaced to produce a consciousness that was both heightened and unsettled. As weeks turned into months, the subtle transformation was neither linear nor universal. Some women resisted internally, clinging to memory and ideology. Some quietly absorbed the care and began to reconsider notions of trust, morality, and human capacity for civility. Observers occasionally commented on this, noting that individuals who had arrived with rigid postures or wary glances sometimes relaxed in gestures so slight they could have been dismissed. Yet any shift carried anxiety. Would the world beyond the camp recognize or reward such adaptation, or would it remain an invisible, fragile interior change? The paradox extended to the spatial and environmental details of the camp itself. Concrete barracks, barbed wire fences, and guard towers contrasted with the small gardens, planted flowers, and open fields where the women could glimpse the sky. The sensory experience of space, the echo of voices, the crunch of gravel, the tactile reality of work and routine, mediated their psychological transformation. It was in the ordinary, repeated actions, in the friction of broom against floor, the splash of water in basins, the weight of blankets on shoulders, that the interior life of the prisoners encountered the external world. Even moments of leisure carried tension. Some women were allowed to read, to write, to share small artistic endeavors. Books, letters, and sketches became conduits for reflection, a bridge between inner thought and observable reality. Yet each gesture, however private it seemed, was always performed under the gaze of others, fellow prisoners, guards, or nurses, creating a layered psychology in which ordinary acts became infused with subtle vigilance. The interplay of autonomy and surveillance, freedom and constraint, developed into a rhythm that defined the lived experience of camp life. And throughout, the sensory paradox persisted. Soap and water, bread and soup, beds and blankets. These objects of ordinariness carried the weight of contradiction. Comfort administered by captors, discipline intertwined with care, humanity within confinement. Observers recorded compliance and routine, prisoners recorded memory and sensation, yet neither fully captured the interior dissonance, the mingling of relief, suspicion, gratitude, shame, and quiet wonder. It was a psychology forged in repetition, observation, and small, intimate encounters that bore the weight of a larger, brutal history. By the time the first announcements of repatriation arrived, the women had already undergone a subtle, almost imperceptible transformation. Not in ideology, not in overt sentiment, but in the quiet registration of care and constraint, of human gestures that unsettled memory and expectation. The barbed wire, the uniforms, the baths, the meals, the labor, each had left its trace, creating a pattern of interiority that defied straightforward explanation. As they prepared to leave to return to Europe, they carried not just memories of war, but memories of mundane yet extraordinary acts of attentiveness that both surprised and unsettled them. In this, the daily rhythms of camp life, the simple acts of hygiene, the repetitive labor, and the quiet observation became the framework through which the women's psychological lives were recalibrated. The paradox endured: human care administered within systems of control, ordinary gestures that unsettled memory, and a consciousness reshaped by the strange coexistence of constraint and attention. These were not stories of heroism, nor tales of vilification, but the sober testimony of ordinary human experience intersecting with history in ways that were intimate, unsettling, and unresolved. The story of German women prisoners in America is, therefore, less about liberation and more about transformation. It is less about victory and more about the quiet, almost invisible effects of care, routine, and observation upon bodies and minds conditioned for war. It is the sound of water against skin, the friction of hands against soap, the weight of blankets at night, the taste of bread and soup, the texture of cloth and concrete, small, persistent traces of humanity that survive even under the shadow of captivity. In these traces lies the paradox. They were prisoners, yet they were treated with a dignity that unsettled them. They were bound by circumstance, yet exposed to intimacies of care that no enemy could have anticipated. And it is in this quiet, persistent dissonance that the story finds its rhythm, not in the sweep of armies or the headlines of newspapers, but in the texture of lived experience, in the sensory and psychological contours of a world where war, captivity, and care intersected in a way that would linger long after the gates were opened, long after the soap had dried, long after the women returned to cities scarred by conflict. The women left the camps under skies that had grown pale with early winter light, trucks carrying them to distant ports where ships awaited to return them to a Europe that was still scarred, fragmented, and uncertain. Their feet had walked the wooden floors of barracks hundreds of times, their hands had scrubbed the concrete, held the soap, lifted tin trays, tended small gardens, and yet the memory of these mundane actions followed them with a quiet persistence. For some, the act of leaving was accompanied by relief, for others by a strange hesitation, a sense that the ordinariness of care they had received might not exist outside the wire, that the subtle human gestures woven into their captivity were a fragile, almost unreal experience. Letters were carried home in pockets, diaries tucked under coats, the faint scent of soap and liniment clinging to clothing like a residue of time. When they arrived in towns and cities, bombed-out streets and crowded trains, the world had not paused for their absence. Families greeted them with cautious joy, neighbors stared with curiosity, and strangers sometimes whispered in corridors about the survivors of the German war effort. Yet in these reunions the memory of the American camps lingered, intangible but insistent. One former prisoner wrote decades later of the dissonance, the contrast between streets lined with rubble and the quiet precision of a bath, the warmth of water, the scent of soap and linen. These details, so trivial to an outsider, had become markers of a strange interior life, a dimension of survival that did not conform to heroism or shame. Time, as it did for all who survive, layered memory with sediment. Some women spoke rarely of the camps, some filled notebooks with meticulous recollections of days, of routines, of conversations half remembered. One recalled standing at attention during inspection, the thin sunlight slicing through a window, dust motes dancing in the beam, and feeling the brush of cloth against skin as a reminder that care could be imposed, that hygiene could be both ordinary and extraordinary. Another remembered the quiet laughter shared over a tin of bread, the fleeting glance at a neighbor as they completed their assigned labor, and the paradox that these small moments had carried a weight heavier than any command or reprimand. Even decades later, when the war had receded into history books and photographs, the camps persisted in memory. The barbed wire, the guard towers, the cold concrete floors, the echo of footsteps and the steady drip of water in showers, remained vivid in recollections. The women who had once been prisoners carried with them not only the physical memory of those spaces but the psychic imprint of routine and care, of confinement that was simultaneously restrictive and nurturing. It was a duality that haunted them, to be contained and yet treated with ordinary decency, to be marked as an enemy yet recognized as a human being. Observers and historians have since recorded official details. Numbers of prisoners, dates of arrival and departure, inspections and incidents, daily logs of labor and hygiene. Yet in private letters, diaries and interviews, a different story emerges, one less about policy and more about the texture of lived experience. The mundane gestures, repeated over weeks and months, became measures of a quiet psychological transformation. Some women described it as a subtle resilience, others as disorientation, and yet all recognized that the simple acts of care, a bar of soap, warm water, clean linen, regular meals, had created fissures in their understanding of cruelty, morality, and human behavior. They returned to homes often partially destroyed, cities haunted by missing faces, neighbors changed by war, and landscapes marked by both reconstruction and absence. In these settings, the memory of the camps occupied an ambiguous space, neither fully consoling nor entirely disturbing. One former prisoner wrote of standing in a ruined kitchen, inhaling the cold air through a shattered window, and suddenly recalling the sound of water splashing in a barracks shower, the scent of soap, the tactile friction of hands on skin. It was a memory both vivid and disquieting, highlighting the strangeness of human experience in wartime, that even under surveillance, even under constraint, ordinary acts could leave an imprint far deeper than visible damage or recorded history. Recollections from guards and nurses similarly reveal unease in retrospect. They spoke of efficiency, duty, and procedural correctness, yet admitted that the human responses they witnessed, hesitation, relief, subtle gestures of gratitude or defiance, were not easily catalogued or analyzed. Some reflected that the care extended to prisoners, even as part of routine, had shifted their understanding of the limits of authority and the capacity of ordinary kindness to unsettle ingrained assumptions. In letters written years later, one guard confessed, "I did not know then how strange it was, how unsettling, to see them wash and rise from the water as if nothing had happened, yet everything had shifted inside them." This interior transformation, subtle and often invisible, was neither heroic nor redemptive. It was human, ordinary, persistent. Diaries recount nights when the women lay awake in barracks, blankets tucked around shoulders, listening to the wind against tin walls, the distant whistle of trains, the murmur of companions' voices. These were moments of reflection, of quiet confrontation with memory and expectation, where the significance of small gestures, a bar of soap, the scrape of broom on floor, the measured cadence of work, became amplified in the stillness. Some felt shame at recognizing a shift in themselves. Others simply noted it, recording quietly the tension between what they had been, what they were, and what the world now expected them to be. The psychological weight of these experiences persisted long after repatriation. Some women carried tactile reminders, the softness of washed skin, the warmth of blankets, the friction of lathered hands, as though these sensations themselves were evidence of an impossible reconciliation between constraint and care. Memory layered upon memory, the destruction in Europe, the absence of loved ones, the bureaucratic indifference of official reports, and the quiet intimacies of daily camp life formed a complex landscape that could not be neatly parsed into victory, defeat, or morality. Even in later life, conversations with family or scholars revealed the subtle persistence of these traces. One woman described seeing a bar of soap in a store decades later and experiencing an involuntary shiver, recalling the smell, the weight, the texture, and the impossibility of fully separating the object from the memory it carried. Another recounted teaching her children to wash their hands and realizing that the act, so ordinary, had once been a locus of tension, discipline, and paradox. A small ritual that had both comforted and unsettled. The past, tangible yet elusive, persisted in the ordinary acts of life, quietly shaping consciousness and memory. What had been ordinary was extraordinary. The act of bathing, once a point of hesitation and surprise, became emblematic of the strange intersection between confinement and care, control and compassion. Food, labor, attention to routine, all carried the residue of paradox. They were prisoners yet humanly treated, observed yet quietly transforming. The dissonance between external circumstances and interior experience lingered, unresolved, an echo that no passage of time could entirely erase. Years later, when historians or journalists asked for recollections of captivity, the women's answers were careful, measured, reflective. They spoke of routines, of observation, of care that was simultaneously ordinary and disruptive. They described the paradox without simplification, the faint perfume of soap in a barracks, the steady rhythm of warm water, the friction of hands against skin, the murmur of companions, all things that suggested humanity within constraint, complexity within structure, and uncertainty within care. Even as decades passed and Europe rebuilt itself, the memory of these small, intimate acts persisted. They were not celebrated in public histories. They were not memorialized in monuments or plaques. They existed in diaries, in whispered conversations, in the faint remembrance of skin once washed, hands once scrubbed, bodies once exposed to ordinary care in extraordinary circumstances. These traces were not easily reconciled with notions of victory, defeat, morality, or redemption. They were, instead, evidence of the quiet, unsettling persistence of human experience, of how the ordinary can haunt, and how care can unsettle the assumptions forged in conflict. In the end, the paradox endured. The women returned to lives scarred and reshaped by war, yet they carried within them the subtle imprint of daily gestures that had redefined their sense of self. Soap, water, labor, meals, blankets, and the rhythms of observation remained lodged in memory, faint yet persistent, tangible yet elusive. They were proof that even under surveillance, even in captivity, human experience could find ways to surprise, unsettle, and transform. And so, the story closes not with certainty, but with a question suspended in memory. How does one reconcile the ordinary gift of care with the extraordinary weight of history, the paradox of freedom within confinement, the quiet intimacy offered by those who were, by circumstance, both enemies and caretakers? It is a question that persists, silent yet insistent, long after the gates have closed, long after the soap has dried, long after the women have returned to a world they once sought to understand, and that now understands them only partially.